Hey everybody, it's Nick from SonicTone Amps. In today's video, we're going to talk about biasing a tube amp, what it is, why it's needed, and how to do it. Now this is going to be a bit more of an academic video, so if a little bit of tech talk and some math scares you, then avert your eyes. But if you're a big nerd like me, then come along for the ride. So what is biasing a tube amp? Biasing a tube amp is setting the amount of current flowing through the powered tube while there is no signal present in the tube or it's at rest or idle. Aspen Pittman, the founder of groove tubes, is often credited with a popular analogy that setting the bias of a tube amp is like setting the idle of a car. So with that, the tube is allowed to perform in an optimal way once the signal is applied to the grid. And if the bias is set too low or cold, then it might sound a little mushy or flat. That's how some people describe a cold bias tube. Or if it's set too high, then the tube would be running too hot, and that could wear down the tube quicker, shorten the lifespan, and in extreme cases, it could cause red plating, which is dangerous for the tube, and if left unchecked, could permanently damage the tube. So there are two main ways to bias a tube amp. One is grid biased, also called fixed biased, and the other is cathode biased, also called self-biased. With the goal being to control the current flow in the power tube, these are just two different ways to achieve that. And we're going to go over the pros and cons of each. With a grid biased amp, negative DC voltage is applied to the grid of the power tube, and the amount of that negative DC voltage is what will control the flow of current through the power tube. So the more negative DC voltage there is, the less current's allowed to flow, and the less negative DC voltage there is, more current's allowed to flow. Contrary to its other name being fixed bias, this type of bias is actually adjustable, usually by a pot that's located in or on the amp. And with that pot, you can fine tune the amount of negative DC voltage going to the grid to set your bias accordingly. The pros and cons of grid bias or fixed biased amps is that you do have to spend a little more on components, putting together the negative DC voltage power supply. But with it, you do get a little more headroom, a little more firmer feel, and these type of amps don't distort as quickly. And they can be used for higher power amps, anything over 40 watts. With a cathode biased amp, the power tube cathodes are connected to a resistor and capacitor to ground, and the value of that resistor will control the current flow through the tube. So therefore, the higher that resistor value, the more resist flow, and the less flow is allowed. And then the lower that resistor value, the more flow is allowed to happen, so more current flow can go through the tube. Once the value of that resistor is determined, and everything's just soldered in place and left alone, as the tubes are now self-biasing. And really nothing else is needed, and nothing else really needs to be adjusted. The only catch is you just got to make sure you use the same types of power tubes that the circuit is designed for. The pros and cons of a cathode biased amp is, well, you don't need a negative DC power supply, so that's good there. They tend to have more dynamic, sustain, and harmonics, and they do tend to distort a little quicker, which may or may not be preferred. But with the anatomy of a cathode biased amp, they tend to be only lower powered amps, like 40 watts or less. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there, misinformation about biasing at tube amps. You'll have one guy tell you, oh, you got EL34, set it at 45. Another guy tell you get 6L6s, set those at 50. You need to set your amp at 70%. And you're sitting here scratching your head like 45 what? Millivolts? I thought we were talking about current. Isn't it milliamps? And 70% of what? I don't know. The problem is that setting the bias of a tube amp is the result of an equation, of which in many cases you don't have all the variables. So just plucking a number out of the thin air and saying that's the number it needs to be may or may not be the right bias setting for your tube amp. Now it might be close, but you know, you really need to get the other variables in there to figure out what the right actual value should be. Now that said, these numbers that people throw out are general averages over many years of a lot of different tube amps that have a lot of common properties, use some of the same tubes, have some of the same values of their B plus voltage. So a lot of people just make the assumption, oh, it's this type of amp with EL34s, you can set it at 45 and forget about it or whatever. But we're not here for that. We want to get an accurate bias setting and an accurate bias reading. So we want to do the math behind it to figure out what the best setting is. Like I said, biasing a tube amp is the result of an equation, and that equation has three variables. It's power equals current times voltage. Or in this case, power, the plate dissipation of the tube in watts, equals the plate current times plate voltage. And you're going to need two of those variables to figure out the third. We're trying to figure out the current, we can get the plate voltage, and we know the plate dissipation we're targeting from the spec sheets of the tubes themselves. Now this is where that 70% rule comes in. It's long been accepted that for a fixed biased Class AB amp, 70% of max plate dissipation is a safe bias set point for a tube. So let's use the example of an EL34. We know from the tube spec sheet that its max plate dissipation is 25 watts. So 70% of that is 17.5 watts. Now we've got one of our variables that we're targeting. And when we open up the amp, we can measure the plate voltage, and now we've got the second of our variables, and we can use those two variables to figure out our plate current. So whether it's grid biased or cathode biased, you are measuring the same properties of the tube, the plate current, the plate voltage, and the plate dissipation. And one of those two methods are really just like a faucet on the tube that allows you to turn it to increase the current flow or decrease the current flow to get that plate dissipation where you want it for the bias set point. So one other thing to mention, what we've just talked about is measuring the bias at the plate current and at the plate of the tube. One other way that people do it is they'll measure it at the cathode. They'll measure the cathode current, which always comes in a little higher than the plate current for reasons that we're not going to get into in this video. But by using the cathode current to set your bias point, some people consider that a little safer because the value is a little higher. And so, for example, if you set it to where you're at 70, 72% using the cathode current value, if you go back and check it at the plate current, you'll see that it'll probably be a little lower and you might be at like 68%. A lot of fixed biased amps will have ports or jacks on the back of them that will allow you to check the cathode current easily across a 1 ohm resistor. All SonicTone fixed biased amps have this. So with that said, let's go ahead and go into the workshop and open up a couple of amps and check their bias. Alright, so here we have a fixed biased or grid biased amp that uses a pair of 6L6s, so it's a Class AB push-pull amp. And with a fixed bias amp, you will get, in most cases, and definitely all SonicTone fixed bias amps, you will get these bias probes here, which are very convenient in allowing you to measure the cathode current, which is a quick way to do a bias check. But what we do inside of the amp to get the more accurate bias check is we measure the plate current. And what we're going to do here is the very first thing we're going to do, nothing's on, nothing's plugged in. And we're going to go ahead and put our multimeter on ohms, and we're going to measure the resistance of the primary windings of the output transformer. So we're going to start over here on the left power tube, left to our perspective, and we are going to get about 46 on the dot. Then we're going to check the right power tube, and we are going to get 48 on the dot almost. Let me see. Yeah, we'll call it 48. Now from there, we're going to go ahead and turn the amp on. We're going to give it a speaker load. We're going to give it the AC. Now remember, don't do this unless you're comfortable doing it and knowledgeable in working on tube amps, because these tube amps can contain a lot of voltage that can really pack a pop and really hurt you, so we don't want that happening. Now, what we've got here, I'm going to go ahead and turn standby on, so we're live. All the controls are down at 0. And now what we want is we want to get what our B plus voltage is. Now for convenience, I'm going to go ahead and plug that into the ground point there, and I'm going to switch this guy down to DC voltage, and we're good to go. So let's go ahead and get that B plus, which is kind of off frame, to the left, and then also check the plate voltage on the left tube. So we are at 431.2 and 428.8. Now let's check the plate voltage. It's on the right tube. Also 428.8. So we have all the variables we need. We have the resistance of the primary windings of the output transformer. We have the overall B plus voltage, and then we have the plate voltage on pin 3 of both the left and right power tubes. Now for something a little different, what we're going to do is we're going to switch the multimeter over to millivolts DC, and we're going to take a look at what the cathode current is. Again, these amps, these fixed bias amps, typically come with these probes, these bias probes here, that are going across a 1 ohm resistor, and you can actually measure the voltage drop and then easily convert that using Ohm's law to current. So right now that's going to tell us that on the right power tube we're getting about 51 millivolts of a voltage drop. A quick little math exercise will tell us that's exactly the milliamps as well, because it's a 1 ohm resistor. So we'll call it 51.5. And then let's go ahead and switch it over here to the left power tube, and we'll see that it is going to settle at about 54.7. So it's always interesting to see how the cathode current compares to the plate current. Now this is a fixed bias amp, which actually means it's adjustable. Most amps like this will have a pot either on the amp or inside the amp that you can turn. Right here you can see it. I'll take a wooden stick and point to it. This pot, you can probably see it. It's right here. So it's on the outside of the amp. So a quick bias adjustment for any SonicTone amp does not require you to actually open up the amp. You can use these test jacks here to measure the cathode current to get a sense of where it's at. And then you can use this pot. I'm going to reach under and around very carefully around the power tubes. So you can see as I adjust it, the pot, if I bring it down even further, it's getting cold. There you go. So I brought it down further and it got pretty cold by where it was anyway. So I turned it a little more to get it back up to that 54-ish mark. There we go. So that's interesting because you can actually see in real time what's happening to the current as you turn the voltage up and down, the bias voltage. And that is, again, negative bias voltage. So if we go back to DC voltage here, and my bias supply is right here above these wires, I can actually put my probe on it, and you'll see that we've got about negative 62 volts available in the bias supply. So if we go to the grid, we'll see there is about negative 41 volts. So that's how it works. Again, it's one of the drawbacks of a fixed bias is that you have to have the extra components for a bias supply. But if you set it up correctly with the adjustable pot, you can easily turn that to tailor this exactly how you want it to see what your bias is doing. So there you have it.
All right, everyone. Here we are. We have an Excel file that I use that has some calculations and some formulas in it to help me bias an amp. It's all kind of just stored in there, and I can plug in some of the numbers that we just recorded by probing inside the amp, which I did here. So if you remember, we recorded for this particular 6L6 amp. It was the Patriot. We recorded the B plus voltage at about 431.2. And we recorded the plate voltages of both tubes to be about the same, which is odd, but 428.8. And then remember, before we did all that, we recorded the resistance of the two legs of the primary windings of the output transformer, 46 ohms and 48 ohms. And from there, the formula is programmed into this Excel file. We'll do some of the math for me, like figure out the voltage drop at the two output tubes. So here you got 2.4 and 2.4. And then from there, it's calculating Ohm's law with the resistance. And this, plug that in here. I have the calculator over here. It's a SonicTone calculator at calc.sonictone.amps.com. Anyone can use it. It's available. It's got a lot of common equations you need for this sort of thing. But here we know we've got a resistance of 46, and we've got a voltage drop of 2.4. I'll plug that in, and you're going to get 52.17 milliamps that you have here. The same thing happens on the second tube between the 48 ohms and the 2.4, and you get a flat even 50 milliamps of current on the plate of output tube number 2. And from there, now we can click over to the power equation that I've mentioned before, which is power equals current times voltage. and we will take the plate current here, which for tube number 1 is 52.17, times its voltage at the plate, which is 428.8, and we will get 22.37, won't we? So let's try that over here just for verification purposes. And I'm going to go, in this calculator, you can plug in a third optional variable, which is the max dissipation of the tube you're working with, which is 30 watts for 6L6 GC, because it'll just figure out for you that with these two values, you're hitting 22.37 watts, which you see here. And also, it's a 30-watt tube. That means you're at about 74.57% plate dissipation of the max plate dissipation. Same thing with the second one. We plug in the values and we get 71. I'm okay with anything between 70 and 75 personally. That's a pretty good target for me. But what I did want to point out was that we did measure the cathode current as well, and I said it's usually a little higher than the plate current. You can see it's a milliamp or two higher, which is fine. So if you work off of this value instead and set to that, because it's higher, your bias is actually going to be a little more safe and a little lower. Which is totally fine. And in this amp, you've got those probes, those bias jacks in the back that allow you to work off the cathode current, which is totally fine. But like we did the more accurate way, where we opened up the amp and measured the actual plate current and plate voltage to get a pretty dead-on accurate value for the bias setting for that amp. While we're on the screen, I want to point out how we talked about earlier. You just can't pluck a number out of the air and say, oh, this is a 6L6 amp. The current should be X, or it should be Y, or whatever. These variables that go into these equations really influence what it is. And this particular amp is using a transformer that is delivering kind of a low B plus voltage for this type of amp. We're at 431, right? And so the current is allowed to be a little higher, 50 milliamps, 52 milliamps, to get us into the 70% target. But let's take a theoretical example here. If we were to, have a B plus voltage, maybe a little more normal for an amp like this, might be as high as 480. Right, the max voltage on 6L6 is 500, we're still within range. And let's say there's a 2-volt drop on the plates, so we'd be at 478 for the plates. Now look what happened to the current. It dropped almost 10 milliamps, but we're still close to the 70% mark. But we're only at 43 milliamps. So this, I think, really underscores why it's important to do these measurements and do this work to make sure you're in the right range and you're not just setting it willy-nilly at some value that you read off the internet. Okay, what we've got here is a cathode bias amp. It actually happens to be a single-ended Class A amp, so there is only a single power tube, but the same principles apply. It's an EL34 power tube, max plate dissipation of 25 watts. And what we're going to do first, right now, nothing's on, the voltage is drained out of the amp and nothing's hooked up. We're going to actually measure the resistance across the primary winding of the output transformer. That's our starting point. We want to know that value. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to measure from the plate here, this pin 3, to this dark blue wire, and we are going to get about 100 ohms, almost exactly. Then the next step is that we want to go ahead and hook everything up. Got my speaker load here. We're going to give it some AC. Again, don't do this unless you're comfortable and knowledgeable in working on tube amps, because the voltages in here can be lethal and really pack a punch. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and turn it on. All the controls are set to 0 at this time. What we're going to do first is we're going to measure the B plus at the tap of the primary winding and see what that voltage is. We're going to turn the multimeter to volts DC. There you go. And let's go ahead and go live with this. And here we go. Let's see what our B plus currently is. So the B plus is 381.3, we'll call it. And the plate voltage is looking like 375.6. So while we're in here, let's take a look at what the voltage drop is across the cathode resistor of this cathode biased amp. That way it'll give us a sense of what the actual cathode current is versus what the plate current is. Looks like it's about 21.8. So let's take a look at the cathode biased amp that we did. This is the SE12 Class A single-ended cathode biased amp. And remember, we did the measurements. We got 100 ohms for the output transformer resistance. We got 381.3 as the B plus. We got 375.6 as the output tube plate voltage. That equated to a 5.7 volt voltage drop. The same equations are plugged into here. We can do this and get a even 57 milliamp plate current, which turns into a 21.41 watts of plate dissipation, which equates to about 85% of the max plate dissipation of the EL34 that was in there. Now, before you say, oh, whoa, that's way higher than 70%, the 70% rule kind of goes out the window for cathode bias amps. It really is only for the fixed bias, grid bias amps. When it comes to cathode bias amps, the general rule of thumb is a lot of people like to hit about the 90% rule for plate dissipation, even sometimes as close to 100%. Cathode bias amps do run a little hotter. The trade-off is you may be replacing the tubes a little sooner than later, but it's a small price to pay for this style of amp with a certain sound to it and this type of bias. Now, one thing we didn't talk about was that this amp actually has a switch to go between a tube rectifier and a solid state rectifier. I have other videos out there that talk about the differences between the two. And what ends up happening is the solid state rectifier is going to deliver a little higher B plus voltage, as you can see here. Therefore, the output tube plate voltage is going to be a little higher, a little bit more of a drop, voltage drop there. So therefore, the current's going to be a little higher. And we're going to get closer to about, when it's all said and done, about 94.8, almost 95% plate dissipation. I'm actually totally fine with this because it's great. We're kind of straddling. If we're aiming for like a 90% mark, we're kind of straddling that. We're on the tube rectifier. We're a little lower at about 85.6. And then on the solid state rectifier, we're a little higher at about 94.8. And I'm totally fine with that. I think that's a good spot to be at. Again, we were doing this with a 330 ohm cathode resistor, just to kind of mark that down. We did look at the cathode current across that cathode resistor, right? And we figured out that it was 66 milliamps, which again, like I said, the cathode current always runs a little higher than the plate current. You have the grid current in there and other things that are going to drive it up. And all that's totally fine. What we did was we measured the voltage drop across this cathode resistor. Turned out it was about 21.8. And so we put that up against the 330 ohms in Ohm's law, and it gives us the 66 milliamps right there of cathode current.
Okay, so I did want to talk about common issues with bias because I've had a couple things happen to me. I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about them here. When something happens with the bias of a tube amp and something really goes out of whack, one of the most common things you'll see is one or all of the tubes red plating, which is a big signal that something's gone wrong. And you should shut your tube amp off immediately. So what's happened to me, interestingly, I've had two things happen, one to each type of amp. I've had it happen to a cathode biased amp and a fixed biased amp. With the cathode bias amp, what happened was I was at practice, and as I'm playing, I noticed that my sound's starting to get weak and faint, and it happens to be an amp where there's a vent hole on the top, and you can look down and see the power tubes. And I look down, and there's two EL84s, and one of them's red plating. So I'm like, oh no, and I shut my amp off, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on. So I get it into the shop, and because it's one tube, I have to think, okay, well, is it the tube? Is there a short? Quickest way to figure that out, swap the tubes and see if the problem moves with the tube or if it stays on that socket. Turned out it stayed on that socket. So after I figured that out, I went in and looked at the socket, checked it out. The socket had a bad pin that was causing current to flow at max rate and causing the tube to red plate. So I was able to replace the socket there and everything was back to working order. So there was a failure in the socket. On the fixed biased amp, I was actually prototyping an amp and I was doing some experimentation, and it was around where the bias circuit was. And what happened was I'd soldered some things quickly and was moving some things around to try some different values, and I made a bad solder joint. And so when I went to turn the amp back on to try it out, one of the power tubes red plated. And so I shut it off, I checked it out. Turned out there was no bias voltage. This was a fixed bias amp again. No bias voltage was getting to that tube. So I was able to figure out it was a bad solder joint. I did quickly. I put it back together, resoldered it, and everything was fine. So I just wanted to bring it up because, those are some common things that can happen when, people will call it losing bias. The tube's not getting the correct bias voltage, or something happened with the cathode bias resistor, and then all of a sudden things go haywire, and the most common thing is the tube will red plate. So I just kind of wanted to share those experiences with y'all, so you know, in case anything like that happens to you in the future, and you'll be able to quickly fix it, hopefully. Alright, that about wraps up this video on biasing a tube amp. I hope it wasn't too technical and y'all were able to follow along and learn a few things. As always, check back for more videos here on our YouTube channel and social media, and check out SonicTone Amps at sonictoneamps.com. I'll see you soon.